Hey everybody, part 3 now of this video on imaging. And so now we're going to get into some things that a lot of guys feel are a little bit intangible, and it's going to make some of the flat earth guys' head spins just a little bit, because we're going to talk about the quality of the parts used inside a loudspeaker and how those parts affect imaging. And again, when I say imaging, I'm talking about everything that encompasses the whole soundstage, the layering, the space between things, all that kind of stuff. So I've got some examples up here on the table of some things that just eat imaging up. They just eat it up. These are a couple crossovers out of some speakers that have come in for upgrades. This one, an SVS speaker. This one, a clip speaker. Both of them have kind of the same level of parts in them. On both of them, there's a reasonable level of parts on the tweeter itself. You know, the little parts are out here. The rest of this stuff is pretty much garbage. And those garbage level parts, those cheesy parts, will just eat imaging up. It will make the soundstage very flat and very two-dimensional. Now, the way it does that, it kind of does it all over. Let's start with the woofer circuit. When you've got iron core inductors in the circuit playing all the way up through the mid-range, all the way up to a tweeter, in fact, those little iron cores will tend to hold a little residual charge, and it tends to have a sound that's a little more of a smear of the sound. It'll take the vocal and it'll just kind of smear it instead of it being really crisp and clear like you'd get from an air core. An air core is a more open sound. It's more natural, versus when you start sending the vocal through an iron core inductor, it sounds more subdued. It's just more blurred, and it tends to have a flatter sound to it. Even more so as we move higher up in frequency, all those spatial cues and things that really create that soundstage are in the higher frequencies. So as you start moving up, it starts getting real critical. All these little sandcast resistors have a little bit of an effect, and electrolytic capacitors, they're slow discharging. They have a really big effect. These little mylar caps are pretty cheesy. Even some of these really cheap poly caps that are used, that are made in China, they have a much slower discharge rate than some of your higher end capacitors. So think of it as the signal goes in, it holds it, and then it discharges it, something like that. There's a smeared effect on that, and it takes the resolution and the detail levels, and it just crunches those together, and so you no longer really hear clear separation between things in the soundstage. You'll hear one instrument kind of on top of another, versus you go in and you put really high-end parts into a signal path, and suddenly you hear that space between those instruments. Like, oh my gosh, there's clearly this instrument and that instrument in its own space. They're not smeared together to make one harmonious sound. They're distinct instruments there. Same with the vocals. You may notice instead of the vocals being a harmonized mush, you start hearing each person that's harmonizing within the vocal clearly and distinctly. You can hear each person. And especially, again, in the top end, the whole top end, when you put this level of parts in there, it just collapses the sound stage down. And it becomes real apparent when you've got speakers set up really well in a really well-treated room. You know, I noticed it in this room just like that. And Ron, my good buddy over there, who y'all know edits all my videos, he's built a sound shed. It's a phenomenal tool to be using to do reviews in. And I've listened to a lot of stuff over there, and I'll just casually listen to something, or he'll have me listen to something just if something's really cool, he wants to show me, wow, this is really good, or something like that. And I've heard a lot of different things over there, and there's times I hear a speaker and you think, man, those things sound flat. You know, those things just, there's no depth of imaging there. And I could name quite a few of them that just, they don't open up. They're just congested within the box. and within that plane, and sure, you get a vocal in the middle of the soundstage, but it's a very congested, very flat soundstage, and we can go in and drop in, for instance, a pair of encores, and you put the encores back in. It's like, oh wow, man! It's like there's depth of soundstage there, and especially when we keep going back to these, because these have been in development for a while, and so these speakers had a lot of time on them, and we've kind of used them as a platform to test various aspects. And over there in Ron's room, you can really hear all the differences that come to play. When you've got a setup that allow those things to be heard, they can be heard. And when you have a setup that doesn't allow those things to be heard, you're just not going to hear them, even if it's reproducing them. I've even had guys that I've known that have mixed certain bits of music themselves, or it's their music, it's them playing on that music. Or I've had someone from a studio that's mastered something or mixed something, and they'll bring a CD over. And in all those regards, I've had people say, I'm hearing things in the music I've never heard before. And it's not that they're hearing something that they didn't realize was there that's part of the sound of it, of the amplitude. It's usually within the soundstage. I didn't realize that there were those spatial cues that were there. Most people who mix and master, unfortunately, many of them are just hearing the sound from a pair of Mackie or Genelec studio monitors, or some old Yamahas, or some, you name it, and they're just sitting right in front of them like a couple of desktop speakers, and they're not hearing a lot of the aspects that are actually on the recording. And when you get something set up in a really well treated room, you hear those things, and these parts are some of the things that really kill them. It'll eat that right up. So it's what really separates a speaker that's okay from a speaker that's really good. It's the parts quality that goes into these things. And I have a lot of customers who have ordered upgrades that we've designed for various speakers, like some of these. Then they put those upgrades in, and obviously it's a lot cleaner in the way it sounds. There's resolution levels that they're hearing that they never heard before. But the funny thing, they always call or email and say, I can't believe how much better they image. And we get that all of the time. And yeah, when you get some of these parts out of the signal path that are smearing the signal, the imaging can really open up and really become holographic. Not just the parts. Let's move on to another aspect. All the connectors that are in the signal path. Everything that's a connection. All the push-on connectors, all that stuff, and especially binding posts. Especially these little cheap brass ones that have steel nuts on the back of them. Let's talk about that for a second. Anytime you're putting steel parts in the signal path or any ferrous material, it will hold a charge. You're taking electricity and you're moving electricity around that thing, and there's a magnetic field on anything that you're sending that audio signal through. You're sending that audio signal through a speaker cable. It's not just running through that wire. There's a magnetic field around that is part of that signal that's being transmitted. And when you affect that magnetic field, where you're causing it to slow down, or you're causing it a buildup of energy there, like from a static charge or something, it affects the signal passing through it. And it really shows up in those spatial cues. So you get a bunch of steel parts all built up in the signal path, and it really affects the imaging. That's one of the reasons we sell so many tube connectors. These are hollow copper tubes. So you've got your internal speaker wire slide through the copper tube, and you've got your external speaker wire slid through this hollow copper tube, and you wind up with internal and external wiring with a copper sleeve over it. And what it's doing is it's not disrupting the original signal, whereas all the connections you may have had in there before, they are a disruption of the signal. And when you go to something like tube connectors, it provides a cleaner signal transfer. And one of the things that you'll notice in many cases, if you have speakers in a room set up to where you can hear imaging and layering, is that imaging and that layering gets a lot better. It's like you just took things another step. And it's sometimes a surprise to the people who swap these out, knowing that they're going to have an improvement in clarity. And surprise, surprise, improvements in imaging by getting crap out of the signal path. And that's one of the ways to do it. And that's one of the reasons we sell thousands of those things, is because they work really well. I know the funny thing to me is the flat earth guys think that these are the biggest bunch of snake oil that we offer, because all it is a connection. There's no way a connection can have any effect on the way things sound, but they would be absolutely incorrect. These little suckers are going to have a pretty big impact on how things sound. Another big factor is the wiring that can be in there. Some of this old wiring that's in there that's completely oxidized, man, all your spacer cues are just completely eaten up by that stuff, because the higher frequencies, sorry, I'm almost kind of hoarse today, so forgive me, I can barely speak here. The higher frequencies tend to travel across the surface of the wire, and when that wire becomes oxidized, it just really eats up the spatial cues. It just eats it up, and suddenly the soundstage is flat. You can go in and just replace that wire with a high purity copper, like what we use internally. We use polyethylene jacketed, which is a better dielectric material. It does not hold a residual charge, and suddenly they're like, man, the soundstage just opened up when I changed the wiring. I can't believe it did that. And we get that all the time. And yes, PVC coated wire, PVC holds more residual charge than polyethylene or Teflon. Polyethylene or Teflon, it doesn't hold near as much of a charge, and so it affects the signal less. And so when you go to a higher end wire that's got that coating on there, you notice it, especially if you have a system set up like this that we see in here, where we're able to reproduce that stuff quite easily. You swap out that type of wire, and you can hear it pretty evidently. It's not that subtle. And I know a lot of people tend to think, well, I'll just put the biggest gauge wire that I can get in there and go in with a big gauge, and that's the complete opposite of what you want to do for sound quality. You don't want a big gauge wire in there. There is an effect on speaker cable and speaker internal wire when you're sending an audio signal through it, that wire, as it's moving through there, it's alternating current, will create a resonance within the wire. It'll create what's similar to like a standing wave in a room, and it disrupts the coherency of the imaging that you hear because of that disruption. I remember talking on the phone with Tom Teal about it, and his brother Jim Teal was doing a lot of work in that area, and his findings were that if you went to a smaller gauge wire on the tweeters, that it would push that standing wave resonance, basically, if you want to call it that. It pushes the resonance of the wire, or the resonance within the wire and the dielectric, to a higher and higher frequency. And as the gauge gets bigger, that resonance is down into an audible region quite readily. Like there's a disruption there because of that. And so it's better to use that lighter gauge wire where you don't have a need for a high amount of current flow, and you're going to get a better sound from it. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today addresses that thing specifically, and this is one of the Harp devices that I get from Shinyata Research. This is one of the devices that is going into this new speaker from the ones we're doing with Ron at New Record Day. So the new NRD models are going to get a Harp device installed inside the speaker. Now, what the Harp device does is it specifically breaks up those resonances within the wire. In fact, I'm going to read from you right from the Shinyata Research website so that I don't mess this stuff up. So it says Harp was discovered through Gabriel's research into current drift and audio frequency current resonances that occur in speaker cables. Theoretically, a speaker cable may develop current resonances in the audio band, being roughly analogous to standing waves in room acoustics. The Harp module acts as a current mode diffraction device that breaks up these resonances, improving the perceived resolution and coherency of the system. Now, whether you believe some of this or not, and you think maybe that's just a bunch of made up jargon, I can tell you for a fact that dropping this thing in and out of the system completely improves image focus. Like, you think with the speakers like this, the images, it's already incredible, and you think, wow, this sounds unbelievable, and then you drop this on, and suddenly any fuzziness around each instrument, any space around it, just went away, and it became more focused all across the band. Like, it, even down into the vocal region, it's really impressive what these things do. They're not cheap. They're not cheap to make, from what I understand. They're not cheap to buy, and but I bought a lot of them, and we're going to be putting them in these speakers, because once we heard it in the system, we didn't want to take it out. And it was just, it's worth every penny that we're spending on that to keep those things in. And that's one of the tricks that takes this speaker yet another level when it comes to imaging. In fact, while we're talking about it, let's talk about this little speaker for just a minute, because it's kind of what inspired this video. As you know, it's got another one of these wideband drivers, little LGK, on the back. So what it's doing is it's playing things in a way that makes them sound as if they're more in the room, rather than just playing at you from the box. It's like taking what the studio has recorded and playing it back in this room, or whatever room these are set up in. It's like you took that performer and that performance and you put it in the room, because it's adding slightly those room reflections in a more coherent manner. It's more omni, like it's more real in the room than just a representation playing from the speaker. I know some people might think, well, that's not natural for things to go backward. It's like a Bose speaker. It's bouncing sound all over. But it's really not. It's not at all. It is more natural. When, for instance, you take any instrument, and whether it's a saxophone or it's a cymbal hit or any of those things, they tend to radiate in all directions. They don't just play like a speaker, mostly in one direction. Now, as this woofer, or even as this one reaches down into the lower frequency ranges, those ranges become more omnidirectional. They wrap around and they go omni already. But adding that one to the back lets the upper frequency ranges seem more omni as well. So it's extremely real, and it just adds a whole new layer of holographic layering within the image. The other thing that this speaker does that most speakers don't do, very few speakers do, and that is it produces a near perfect step response. So, in fact, let's throw up a measurement I took of this speaker of the step response. And what a step response is a measurement of the time arrival aspects of the speaker. In other words, most speakers with a tweeter and a woofer, they've got sound coming from each of those things, and there is some delay in time of one versus the other. And as a designer, what we do is we try to line up at the crossing over point those wavelengths so that the wavelengths where it crosses are in phase. So everything is in phase, but there is some time delay there. It's very slight, and it doesn't make or break a system. I've got all these other speakers I just showed you that image incredibly well, and even better than a lot of speakers that I've heard that were time aligned in time and phase coherency that produce an accurate step response like these do. It's something, but it's not the only thing. You can still get great imaging from a normal speaker if everything else is done correctly. But everything else being done correctly and having a perfect step response, it does take things yet another level. It's like everything in time is arriving perfect, just as it was laid down in the recording. There's no disruption in time. There's no highs are here and mids are here. They're not coming at you a little out of time. And all of those things tend to add up into making a soundstage that's above and beyond anything we've ever worked with. When you start adding up a lot of little things, the wire, the quality of the parts, perfect step response, output in both directions. It's just imaging like crazy. Now, there are some caveats to that. Because the speaker is radiating the way it is in front and back, and very omni in the way it's playing, you can't put the speaker up against the wall. Speakers are designed for specific applications. Remember, this application is setting out into a treated room. That's what these were designed for. They're not designed for everybody. They're not designed for every application. You can't put them on your desktop. You can't put them on your shelf. They're not going to sound good playing in your garage. That's not what they were designed for. So you have to keep in mind application that they're designed for. But if you're like me and you're like an image freak and you want everything, that's your speaker. I've been having so much fun with these and listening to these. It's crazy. I can't wait to get these into production so that all of you guys out there can hear the capabilities of a speaker that's got this much stuff done to it just to reproduce everything involved with imaging to another level. I guess that's it for this little video. I've covered a lot of little stuff, and hopefully it made sense. Hopefully you guys can take some of this stuff and incorporate it into your DIY builds and keep these things in mind and experiment with them and learn, things that are going to take your system to another level, whether it's fixing your room, pulling your speakers out away from the walls and things like that, or treating your room, using higher quality parts. Any little steps that you make is going to help in all those regards. Even lining a cabinet with no res and getting rid of the resonances of the cabinet, that's going to improve imaging quite a bit too. So a lot of things to take into account, and I hope you guys enjoyed this little bit of a tech talk video. I know we were talking a lot about some of our own products, but it was a perfect way to illustrate this topic. So see you guys in the next video.